here is to hear from our speaker, Arnold Minors, the owner of Arnold Minors and Associates, a consulting firm which he formed in 1984. Arnold distinguished himself at the City of Toronto by being the first senior management consultant that the city ever hired. And in that role, he reconfigured the health department so that we had a community safety plan and we had a well-functioning public health division at the City of Toronto. And for Arnold, he was the person who introduced the concept that community health isn't just your blood pressure and your heart rate and those physical measurements, that it also had to do with the absence of violence and social justice for all. Arnold, 10 years ago, served as press secretary for the Premier of Bermuda, which is where he was born. His professional contributions include being the only Canadian ever elected to the Board of Trustees of the Organization Development Network and president of the Ontario Association for Family Mediation. And his community work included appointment to the Toronto Board of Health and the Toronto Police Services Board. He was the first chair of the board of the African Canadian Legal Clinic. And he immigrated to Canada in 1964. He holds a Bachelor of Science from McGill and an MBA from Queen's. And he's a voracious reader, enjoys weekends spent co-learning with his 4-year-old friend, Donovan. So I hope that wasn't too long an introduction, Arnold. There's lots to say. I tried to make it concise, and now it's over to you to tell us how we are going to fight systemic anti-Black racism. Arnold Minors, please unmute yourself.
Thank you, Sheila, for that introduction. Good morning to all of you. I'm happy to be able to be with you today, this morning. Well, be with you sort of. Virtual is not real. I came because Sheila invited me. And as you know, Sheila is a force of nature and therefore impossible to resist. Resistance will be a theme that I'll return to occasionally during our chat together. I was fascinated to read your mission, your 8 guiding principles, including the most recent one, the 8th, to combat anti-racism, and the 6 sources from which you draw your tradition of trust and mutual support. I was particularly struck by your search for peace and justice, both of which require that we love one another and all of nature, animate and inanimate. It's with that belief that I will talk about my experience with the trials of addressing anti-Black racism. I will start with the part of my story foisted upon me by the Toronto Sun. My view is that the job of the sun, the big one, is to shine a light on truth. When I looked at the weather report for this morning, I learned that it was going to be partly sunny. It caused me to speculate about whether the Toronto Sun should be called the Toronto Partly Sun. My experience is that they're quite selective about where they choose to shine their light. In particular, by one of its journalists, the late, and at least for me, unlamented, Christy Blatchford. I sued the Sun for defamation because they published 3 stories. They published 3 stories, but they turned into 28 different articles. The themes of the 3 stories were: 1, they wrote that I called the Toronto police an occupying army. 2, they wrote that I had asserted that the Holocaust was not a racist act. And 3, they wrote that I did not come to the aid of a police officer who was in distress. To be clear, the judge found that I was not defamed. The Supreme Court of Canada refused to hear my appeal. So it still stands, at least in the injustice system, that the Toronto Sun did not defame me. All those three statements arose by the Sun out of work that I was doing to create justice and equity, especially those of us on the margins. Let me first explain how I came to do this work. The most important person in my life is my godmother. She was my mother's friend, and I asked my mother how my godmother came to be my godmother. And my mother, whose parents were born in St. Kitts, but moved to Bermuda. My mother said that my godmother was the only person in the school who didn't laugh at her accent. So my godmother practiced anti-discrimination, because in Bermuda at that time, anybody who was not born in Bermuda, and Bermuda has a very distinctive accent. It is not similar to, close to any of the other Caribbean nations. So that was how she came to be my godmother. And my godmother and my sister's godfather were at my house frequently for dinner. One day, they were at the table. My mother, I don't think my father was there at the table, but it was my sister's godfather, my godmother, and my mother. And they were talking. I don't know why. They were at the kitchen table. I was sitting on the floor. I don't know why I was outside, because generally being with big people was a very boring thing to do. So maybe it was raining. In any event, I was there, and they were talking about things that were boring me. And at one point, my godmother said something about nature's passport. I'd understood everything that was said up until that point, but I did not understand the term nature's passport. Now you gotta understand, and probably this was true for you as well when you were growing up. I was about 8 when this happened. Children were supposed to be seen and not heard. They're supposed to speak only when they were spoken to. So here I was sitting on the floor saying, "What's nature's passport?" And my godmother looked at me as though I'd grown another head, and certainly 2 more mouths. And then she started to laugh. And she said, "I guess this is my fault." Because she explained that she had told me from the time I was very little that if I didn't understand something that I heard, to ask what it meant. I was supposed to speak up. And so she said it's her fault. And so she said it was okay, and she would explain. So she explained to me nature's passport. And she explained it in this way. She said, "Arnold, you know what a passport is?" I knew that because my father worked for Pan American, which was a huge airline at the time. And you needed a passport to go to go anywhere, but people in Bermuda mostly went to the States or England, and we had passports. So I knew what a passport was. My father was the same age as Mr. Down, Ralph Down, who was the manager of Pan American. My father was a chauffeur. He was the driver for Pan American. They were the same age. My father had gone to the high school that I subsequently went to, and it had, as we were all called then, colored children. Mrs. Down went to the white boys' school. He became manager of Pan American, and as I said, my father, the driver for Pan American. And my godmother explained that even though everybody, including Mr. Down, were clear that my father was the brighter of the two, what Mr. Down had was white skin, which gave him nature's passport. He could go anywhere, do anything because he was white. Competence, relative competence had nothing to do with it. So that was my first learning of systemic discrimination. And my godmother proceeded to tell me this. She said, Arnold, you're a smart colored boy. Your job is to make Bermuda a better place for colored people. She said, it's not fair. It's going to be hard. People are going to be hard on you. Some people are going to fight you. But it's your job. Do you understand? So I was given this charge when I was 8 years old. My godmother has been dead almost 40 years, but I'm more afraid of her than I am anything else. And so I continue to do this work. So that's how I got into it. So let me go to these three statements by the Sun. And I'm telling these stories about the work that I did. And as I said, the work that I did was directed by my godmother. And so it doesn't matter what the Sun says, doesn't matter what a judge says, it doesn't matter what people who phone me say, it doesn't matter when people leave death threats on my phone or mail them to me. I have to do this work. So all those three statements that I'm alleged to have said that the police were an occupying army, that the Holocaust was not a racist act, that I didn't help a police officer in distress. They all came out of work that I was doing to create justice and equity for all, especially those of us on the margins. So the first story is about the occupying army. A man was killed in the parking lot of a club, or just down the street from a club where many Black people attended, mostly Jamaicans. A police officer investigating the case lamented in an interview that was reported in one of the media that these people, referring to Black people, won't speak to us, referring to the police. I was on the police services board at the time, and I was asked why that might be, why Black people wouldn't talk to the police about this murder. And I offered several explanations. One of them was that people don't speak to strangers. Many of us are brought up saying, don't speak to strangers, being told don't speak to strangers. and that police were strangers to Black folk. I use the analogy of American soldiers who were assigned to Britain during what is called by many World War II. The Americans expressed frustration that the Brits would not speak to them. I pointed out that was true even though the Americans were allies. They were strangers to the British folk. That explanation got twisted by the Sun into an assertion that I'd said that Toronto police were like an occupying army. Don't ask me how they got there, that's where they got to. I was in fact making a clear claim that the Toronto police needed to build relationships with Black folk so that they were not seen as strangers, that the police needed to be connected to Black folk, not only in times of crisis. In fact, what I said is the worst time to be drilling for water is when you're thirsty. You need to be connected to people all the time so that when there is a stressful time, they know who you are and will speak to you. My attempt to address Toronto police and Black community relations got turned into something else entirely. It was, I think, a deliberate strategy of resistance to promoting dismantling of anti-Black racism by turning the story of creating connection to one of fostering disconnection. The sun was being only partly sunny, and I think deliberately so as not to create equity, but to heap derision on a Black person who's trying to speak my truth and that of many Black folk. As I mentioned at that time, I had the privilege of being a member of the Toronto Police Services Board, and therefore had an opportunity for speaking out about issues that affected the Black communities. So the second story is about the Holocaust. I was contracted by the ministry, the Ontario Ministry of the Attorney General, to design and deliver a programs with my associates, one of whom now sits on the federal court, A.V. Go, to design and deliver a program to Crown attorneys to help them be competent at, when they exercised their discretion, they did so in ways that did not have racist impact. For example, when they're making recommendations about bail or recommendations about sentencing. This was work to reduce the possibility of decisions that might have racist impact by people who had power. Naturally, the program required a definition of racism in Ontario, where these Crown attorneys did their work. Many of the lawyers, many of those Crowns did not want to be there and said so, often quite publicly. They suggested that since the course was mandatory, the implication was that they were racist. They did not like that implication. So they found ways to resist during the course. There were several of them throughout the province. In one in particular, they kept asking questions about racism in other parts of the world. AV and I would pull the discussion back to Ontario, since racism is time and place specific. I told them they were not in Rwanda or anywhere else other than Ontario. One person then stood up and asked, "What about Germany?" I admit to being enormously frustrated with these people by this time. And in my frustration, it was now just before lunch, I replied that there were Crown attorneys in Ontario and not in Germany, that we were not talking about Germany. During lunch, Avi said to me, some of the people seemed to be quite upset when I had said we're not talking about Germany, and so I should address it. So I took her advice and decided to address it. After lunch, I explained that race, again, was not a biological fact. It was an invention. It's what's often called a social construct. And given force by people who had the power to make their definition of who was inferior stick, as occurred in Nazi Germany. And that, by definition, what happened in Germany was racist, that the Holocaust was definitionally a racist act. A Crown who was not present went to Miss Blatchford at the Sun and told her that I said that the Holocaust was not a racist act. Precisely the opposite of what I did say. Miss Blatchford published that story. The Toronto Sun was being, like today, partly Sun. Let me just say this, and you can read the transcripts. I think they're still available. I mean, obviously, they're still available. This trial was then the longest defamation trial in Canada. It may well still be. The judge, in his decision, relied on the statement of one Crown of the 5 Crowns who were witnesses. 4 of the Crowns, or men, said under cross-examination by my lawyer that I could not possibly have said that the Holocaust was not a racist act. That was a clear admission on their part. The 5th Crown was a woman who testified that she did not want to be there and slept through the entire 2 days of the program, with the exception of waking up once to hear me saying the Holocaust was a racist act, was not a racist act. The judge accepted her testimony in coming to the conclusion that I had said that. I will make no comment about the judge's decision. I won't go into the details about the 3rd story, that I did not help a police officer in distress. However, it was the story that caused me to seek the advice of a lawyer about suing the Sun for defamation. I had not intended to sue the Sun about the occupying army story or about the Holocaust story. This 3rd story, they had simply made it up. I knew that people had asked me, had suggested that I sue the Sun before with the other stories. And I said, no, these people are going to make a mistake. They're going to cross the line. And they did. And that's when I asked my lawyer to sue the Sun, because of that story. The fact is that my lawyer persuaded me that I should sue on the basis of all three stories. It was my loss to the son that had me believe that I should always follow my instincts with lawyers and stick with what I believe will be successful. In any event, the judge found that the son had not defamed me, and I move on. I tell these stories today because they still represent what happens when the major media refuse generally to focus on acts to dismantle racism, to explain what systemic racism means, to foster a genuine conversation about what it means. They do not do that. It does not happen. And the confusion that results is, I believe, deliberate. It's not just the sun. The sun is just an extreme version of what goes on generally. What I'm learning and what I'm hoping to explore with you today is that there are three major tasks in the world. I've come to this learning, and I guess I'm a slow learner. I've come to this learning from my attempts to address anti-racism in general and anti-Black racism in particular. The three major tasks in the world are creation of peace, which is not the absence of quiet. Peace is not the absence of quiet. Creation of justice for all, and fostering survival of Mother Earth. If Mother Earth doesn't survive, there won't be any people to fight for whom there's any reason to fight for justice. I'm learning that there's inevitable resistance to changing the status quo. I guess I've always known that. The status quo in Toronto, in Ontario, in Canada, is an increasingly gross disparity between the haves and the have-nots. The status quo is just us, not justice. The other side of anti-racism is white supremacy. White supremacy is a strategy, in my opinion, for genetic survival. Here's a fact. There are 9 people in the world who are not white. For every 1 white person, survival of whiteness requires a strategy that has been enormously successful. It has universalized the value of whiteness in education, in science. I take note that one of your principles says something about attention to reason and science. I'd urge you to pay attention to what the definition of science is, and it's usually about exploring the natural world, the natural and the physical world, and making conclusions about how it works. And science, at least in Western Europe, is not about examining the spiritual world, which exists. It's harder to make observations about it, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And so I'm just, I guess, suggesting to you that you be clear about what it means when you say in one of your principles that you're going to listen to science. In any event, to continue before I distracted myself, whiteness has been universalized in education and science and religion and language in all areas of human activity. Several years ago, I went to a conference which had advertised continental breakfast. That's not why I went to the conference. When I arrived, I went to the table where the food was being served and looked for the conference organizer. I told her that I was unable to find injera at the buffet table. She asked what injera was. I explained that it was a bread common in Ethiopia, common for breakfast, and that it was, for me, one of the items in a continental breakfast. That for me, the continent meant Africa. She explained that I knew what was meant by a continental breakfast. I knew what continent they were referring to, and I responded that was precisely the issue for me, that I was supposed to understand that the default continent was Europe, that is, white. While I recognize the genius of the strategy, it makes it no less oppressive. I see less often continental breakfast being advertised, but I still encounter the use, for example, of classical music to mean the music of what I call the dwegs of society. I do not have what some call a lisp. Dwegs are dead white European guys. Dismantling the yin of racism and the yang of white supremacy requires a new way of looking at change. It requires a new vision, a new strategy. As Audre Lorde reminds us, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And typically, what's used in attempting to dismantle the master's house, dismantle racism, dismantle white supremacy, are tools of training, tools of restructuring. All those tools are the master's tools. We need to be creative about new tools. To some extent, when I talk about dwegs, I'm using humor because one of the things that I have discovered is that, at least in this country, one way of ensuring a response from the leaders of the society, who are still largely men, white men, heterosexual, Christian, middle and upper class, that humor is one thing that keeps them off base. Attacking their wallets is another. So we need to concentrate on other tools that are not theirs or not used as much. We need to use faith and hope. Faith, as I learned from Hebrews and as you did, is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. We need hope because with faith it endures. And we need love for all of us. Faith, hope, and love. And the greatest and most powerful of these is love. The late Bell Hooks, I urge you, those of you who don't know her well, to find her books, her writings, and read them. She has been a very powerful influence in my life. You may have noticed that I often talk about, I make reference to Black women. That's because of my godmother. I pay attention to Black women. Late Bell Hooks writes about the need for love, that love will help us create a just world for all of us. She talks about power from the margins. She talks about how we can use our place, those of us who are at the margins, to remember what power we have and to use it. I believe that those of us on the margins have much more power than we know. Coming together as we are doing today to find ways to connect and take action is one important way to get us first step. Take first steps we must. Some of them may be wrong. Some of them may be in the wrong direction, takes us in the wrong direction, but we can correct them. But we take them in faith. If we take them in hope, we will overcome. When I say we will overcome, I'm reminded of the words of the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, when he said, and I will read, "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches, but does my eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. And from what I see, I am sure the arc bends towards justice. I have tried to do what I can to create justice. My love for my young 4-year-old friend, Donovan, sustains me in my effort to create and co-create justice for all. My acceptance of this invitation to be with you, my acceptance of the invitation from Sheila to be with you, is because it gave me an opportunity to share my thinking about a vision of a world of peace and love and justice. I have to believe that that kind of world is possible. I know it is necessary. I hope the part sun will someday join us, and all the other regressive preservatives will also join us to create a world worth living for all of us. Peace, justice, joy, and love. I look for it, I work for it. I ask you to join with me in working for it too. I saw from your mission that that's what you are doing. I'm happy to be here today to join with you in that quest. Thank you for listening.
Excellent.